Exodus chapter 3. Back in the beginning of the Bible. But it is National Bible Sunday. I guess every fourth Sunday of the month of January is National Bible Sunday. So it's kind of cool. And I know I've read some of these before, but some different facts about the Bible. It's the most widely read book on the planet. I don't think that's any surprise. Millions of copies are printed each year. It's over 100 million Bibles are sold every year. It's also the most stolen book every year. So maybe that's why so many are printed, because they just keep getting stolen. I don't know. But I guess like hotel rooms, things like that, like there's always Bibles in there, and they just go missing. But in the year 1631, there was a publishing company that published a Bible with a typo in Exodus 20:14 that said, "Thou shalt commit adultery," instead of "Thou shalt not commit adultery." And that has been nicknamed the Sinner's Bible, and apparently there are 9 of them that exist today. The floor is still squeaky, by the way. I can't help to. But the longest word in the Bible, if you guys want to turn to Isaiah 8:3, I have no clue how to pronounce it, but I'd love to hear you guys try. Let me know when you get it, somebody. I know I already told you to turn to Exodus. I'm sorry. What was it? Yeah. Yeah, what you said. What's that? 8:3. Yeah, so it's the... That works. We'll take it. Anybody think they can do better than that? All right, we're good. Okay. Yeah. Is it? But so that's the longest word anyway. But and then the country that produces the most amount of Bibles is China, which is super interesting to me just because of their views on the Bible and Christianity. But so anyway, you can turn to Exodus now. You can practice saying that word later. If anybody perfects it, let me know. Just have your phone speak what it says. But so Exodus chapter 3, if you want to. Everybody's... There you go. My hair shall out. You were pretty good. So, but so today's lesson. We gotta have fun, right? Okay. So today's lesson is going to kind of fall under the "Hey, did you know?" type category. And I kind of talked about this for a minute before, but we're going to talk about the 10 plagues of Egypt. And we kind of know the story of the 10 plagues. At least pretty much everybody does. The 10 plagues and the Pharaoh and wouldn't let the Israelites go. But I was listening to a podcast, I guess it was about a month ago. About a month or so. And the podcast was, it's from Dr. Frank Turek, but it's called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist." I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. Frank Turek or not, but really, really good, really biblical. But his podcast was about like actual proof that the Israelites were in Egypt to begin with. And it was super interesting of like the things he was coming up with and the evidences that they found over the years. But he took a tangent there and was kind of talking about the plagues of Egypt and mentioned how the plagues weren't necessarily just for Pharaoh, I guess, because he refused to let the people go. But he went into more detail about how each of the plagues actually targeted different gods in Egypt. And I never really thought about that. And again, maybe you guys have. Maybe you guys knew that. Did anybody actually know that? Okay, so a couple. But I guess to me, like when you read it or you see the stories, you're like, oh, well, the Pharaoh just refused to let him go. God's punishing him kind of thing. But In Egypt, they worshiped so many gods, little g, of course, so many gods, whether it was the sun, the river, like childbirth, like there was just gods over everything. So pretty much anything that was like a natural occurrence or a natural phenomenon, they had a god for. That was their way of explaining like why things were happening. Like the Nile River would flood every year, therefore helping them with the crops, but they had a god for the water then, so they thanked that god for providing. You know what I mean? So like anything that kind of happened naturally, they had a god for that. And it's super interesting, I guess, when you see through it, because you realize like why God's doing what he's doing. I guess you realize more of what he's doing. But again, the podcast, and he's a YouTube channel too called crossexamine.org, and they do a lot of cool stuff. He goes around to different college campuses, and he'll have the college kids come up and ask him questions, and he's just so quick on like the Bible verses, and it's amazing how fast he is. So I don't know if you've ever seen Frank Turek. Him and there's another guy, Cliff, that goes to college campuses too, and they do a lot together on the podcast. But so it was about the evidences that the Israelites were in Egypt, because when you talk to people about Christianity or just anything, they don't want to believe stuff unless there's proof, right? Anybody ever say, well, you prove to me that Jesus walked this earth, right? Or you prove to me this or that. And then he kind of did a tangent into this. But speaking of proof, we were watching a YouTube video the other day. It was about Noah's Ark. And did you see that, like, they kind of found the ark on the mountain? Have you guys seen that? And I guess an earthquake happened at some point, which, like, shifted the land. And so now you have, like, this rock what they call a rock formation. But it's, like, the exact dimensions of what the Bible says Noah's Ark is. And every year, like, the rains come, and so more, like, land gets washed away. So almost like the sides of the boat are formed every year. And you can see almost like the rib timbers. And they're, like, every 9 feet apart or whatever. And it's, like, I don't know, it's interesting. So it kind of goes back to, like, well, you have to show me the proof. And it's like you see this stuff. And obviously there's disputes on whether it's really Noah's Ark or not. But, you know, there's more of these things out there where, like, the more people try to disprove the Bible, it's almost like the more they prove it true, which is really cool. So it's like, hey, you have to show me proof. And it's like, hey, there's a lot of things we can show you proof about. But, sorry, that's a little side tangent there. But the 10 plagues of Egypt are seen here in the book of Exodus. And in short, there were 10 disasters sent upon Egypt by God to convince Pharaoh to free the Israelite slaves from bondage and oppression they endured for 400 years or so. And God sent Moses and Aaron to deliver the children of Israel and promised to show his wonders as confirmation of Moses' authority. So Exodus 3:20 says, I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof, and after that he will let you go. So the plagues that God sent were for two purposes. Well, at least two. But one, it was to show the Israelites that the God of their fathers is still here, right? He didn't go anywhere. Like, he's still there, he's alive, and he's worthy of their worship. I mean, if you think about it, the Israelites were held captive for like 400 years or so. That's a long time, right? And over that time, they kind of lost faith. Or maybe they believed in God, but didn't think that he could or even would free them after that long. You know, 400 years is a long time to wait. To us, anyway, right? We're very impatient. And I'd imagine they were impatient back then, just like we are today. Maybe not as much as we are, because we literally get everything, like, in a matter of seconds. But the second thing was to show the Egyptians that their gods, little g's, were nothing. You know, they worshipped a wide variety of gods, like we just talked about. And to them, everything that happened naturally, they've created a god for. And worshiped those gods and thanked those gods for everything that was going on around them. But if you want to flip to chapter 5. So Moses approached Pharaoh demanding he let the people go. And Pharaoh replied, I have verse 5 in here, and I don't think that's correct. But Pharaoh replied, and he said, you know, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? And I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. And I have verse 5 written down, but I don't. 2? Okay. Thank you. What's that? That works. It's an upside down 5. Just making sure you guys are paying attention. We're good. So Pharaoh's like, who is this Lord? So all of a sudden, kind of the challenge begins, right? Well, let's find out whose Lord or whose God is more powerful than the other. So we know the story of the plagues again. I realized after listening to this podcast that Exodus 12:12, you don't have to turn there, but Exodus 12:12 actually says, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. So the Bible actually tells you that, hey, part of this judgment is to go after their gods. You see the first plague in chapter 7, if you want to flip there. And we can go through these pretty quick, but chapter 7, verse 17, you kind of see what the first plague is. It says, thus saith the Lord, in this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in mine hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood. Well, the first plague, turning the water to blood or the Nile River to blood, was a judgment against the god Apis, A-P-I-S, which was the god of the Nile. Then you had Isis, which was the goddess of the Nile, and you had Kum, who was the guardian of the Nile. Some of these spellings are very weird, so if you need me to spell it, I can, but they're... So they had kind of 3 different gods that they had over the Nile. And God's like, okay, well, these are the water gods, if you will. Well, I'm going to turn the water to blood. Tell me if your gods can fix them, kind of thing, right? So the river, which was basically the foundation for their daily life, was just ruined, right? It was devastated. All the fish died. The water was unusable, but was their gods able to reverse that? Nope. In chapter 8, go ahead and flip over a chapter. Verses 2 and 3, here you see the second plague. And it says, if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come up into thine house, and into the bedchamber, and upon thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon the people, and into thine ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. So the second plague, frogs, literally frogs were everywhere, was a judgment against the Egyptian god Heket. It's Heqet, who was the goddess of birth. Now, oddly enough, this god had a frog head. So God's basically saying, hey, you like frogs? I'll show you frogs. Right? The frogs invaded everywhere, every part of their homes. And when they died, you see this in verses 13 and 14, but their stinking bodies were heaped up in just offensive piles all throughout the land, and it smelled really bad. So again, their God was not able to do anything about that. Verse 17, you see the third plague, still here in chapter 8. It says, for Aaron stretched out his hand with the rod and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast, and all the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. So this plague, the lice, was a judgment on Set, S-E-T, who was the god of the desert. Now, unlike the previous 2 plagues, I guess Pharaoh had magicians that are like, well, we can do that. We can kind of do that. But unlike the first 2 plagues, they couldn't replicate this one. And in verse 19, they actually say to Pharaoh, hey, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was still hardened, and he refused to let the Israelites go. In verse 21 here in chapter 8, you see plague number 4. It says, else if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And I'll read verse 22 here too. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, and to the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. So the fourth plague of the flies was a judgment on the goddess, I think it's Uachit. Again, spelling is kind of goofy, but which was the fly god. It was a lady of the marshes where the papyrus grows and many insects live, and she kind of guarded all the life of the Nile, but that was their god. You know, she was also depicted with wings, also wore a cobra symbol, as pharaohs did. But God here showed his power, again, over that god, because their goddess, I guess, couldn't do anything about it. But what God did here, too, is his people, the Israelites, weren't affected by the flies. So he showed that, look, he's the one that's in control of the insects, right? Not your gods. Chapter 9, go ahead and flip to chapter 9. And then verse 6, you see the fifth plague here. Verse 6 says, "And the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one." So the fifth plague was the death of livestock, and it was a judgment on their goddess Hathor and the god Apis. Now, both of those gods were depicted as cattle. So they had an appearance of cattle. So this is where I thought it was kind of interesting, because all of these plagues are kind of like a direct judgment on these gods, like the frogs. Like, I'll show you frogs. Hey, cattle? You know, I'll show you cattle. But as with the previous plague, God protected his people again, whereas the cattle of the Egyptians died, but the cattle of the Israelites were protected. In verse 7, you see Pharaoh even sending someone to find out if the Israelites were suffering too, which they weren't. But his heart was still hardened. So he said, still, I'm not letting them go. Verse 10, you see the sixth plague, also in chapter 9. It says, "And they took the ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it up towards heaven, and it became a boil, breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast." So the sixth plague, boils, was a judgment against several gods over health and disease. There was Sunu, Isis, and Sekhmet. Verse 11 even says the magicians couldn't even stand before Moses because of the boils. They even knew that they were powerless against this. And it's just amazing to me to think that here we've gone through 6 of these, and after each one, maybe exclude the first 2, because if Pharaoh thinks he could replicate that. But all of these things happening, and the magicians are like, this is the finger of God. And now they're like, we can't even stand before Moses. But yet Pharaoh's like, no, I'm not letting him go. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too. His heart was hardened, but before God sent more plagues, Pharaoh was kind of given a special message here from God, and basically saying, hey, you've already experienced these, but what's coming next is going to be a little bit more severe. Kind of giving him a warning, right, or a message. And those plagues were designed to convince Pharaoh and all the people that, look, there is none like me on all the earth. Like, I am God. Like, your gods are nothing. You know, Pharaoh was even told that he was placed in his position by God, so God could show his power and declare his name through all the earth. So God told Pharaoh, look, the reason you're here is because of me. And as an example of God's grace, he actually warned Pharaoh to gather whatever cattle and crops remained and shelter them because a storm was coming. So he gave him a heads up even. And some listened, some didn't. But then in the seventh plague, in verse 23 here in chapter 9, it says, "And Moses stretched forth his rod toward the heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and the fire ran along upon the ground. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt." So he gave Pharaoh a heads up that a storm was coming. Now, again, some people listened, some people didn't. But the seventh plague, hail, attacked Nut, who's the sky goddess, Osiris, the crop fertility god, and Set, the storm god. And again, this hail was unlike anything they've ever seen before. And it was accompanied by fire, which ran along the ground and, pretty much everything left out in the open was devastated. But did it hail where the Israelites were? It didn't. Once again, God protected his people. So again, not only is he showing judgment on Egypt and Pharaoh and their gods, but he's also showing the Israelites, like, hey, I'm here, guys. Like, I'm here to worship. But the 8th plague is in chapter 10. Go ahead and flip over. Chapter 10, verse 13. And it says, and Moses stretched forth his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. And when it was morning, the east wind brought the locust. And the 8th plague, locusts, then were again focused on Osiris, Set, and Nut. And they came, they devoured everything that was still living, and there wasn't going to be a harvest in Egypt that year. The 9th plague is in verse 22. He says, and Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. So this 9th plague of darkness was aimed at the sun god Re, R-E, who was symbolized by Pharaoh himself, actually. The land of Egypt was smothered in darkness, but guess what? The homes of the Israelites had light. And then the 10th and final plague here is in chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 29. And it says, and it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. So this 10th plague, or the death of the firstborn, was a judgment on Isis, who was the protector of children. Unlike these other plagues, however, where the Israelites basically avoided them just because they were God's people, like they had light, they weren't affected by the flies. Well, in this case, they had to take action to show their faith that God would protect them this time. So God told each family to take an unblemished lamb, kill it, and I want you to smear the blood on the sides and the top of the door. So that way, when the destroyer was sent through the land and he saw the blood on the door, he would pass over those houses, which is where the term Passover came from. But any family that didn't follow God's instructions would also suffer from this last plague. So the Israelites weren't exactly protected unless they took the step of faith this time. But even Pharaoh's firstborn was killed, and after this, he decided he was going to release the Israelites. He was going to let them go. And by the time the Israelites left Egypt, they had a clear picture of God's power, wouldn't you say? His protection, his plan for them. You know, for those who were willing to believe, they had convincing evidence that they served the true and living God. We just kind of talked about evidence, right? Show me proof. Show me evidence. Well, God gave them plenty of evidence, right? And then what's crazy is even after that 10th plague, Pharaoh once again hardened his heart and chased after them, which is where we lead up to the parting of the Red Sea and stuff like that. But I thought it was interesting, and we all know the stories, but I thought it was interesting to see why the judgments he said. Like, does that make sense? Like, why the plagues were what they were? Because he was going specifically after their gods to show them that their gods mean nothing. God's awesome, isn't he? Like, it's amazing. Now, I want you to flip back to chapter 7 real quick. So he showed them that their gods were nothing, and he also showed the Israelites at the same time that, hey, I'm still here, guys. I'm here for you. Like, you know, I'm still with you. But if you flip back to chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, it tells us that, wait a second, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that I may lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth mine armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. So God always has a plan, right? God knows what he's doing. And even today, like sometimes things happen that we don't understand, but God knows what's going on. But kind of how remember how we talked about, I love to talk about different questions that people have. Well, one question that can come of this is, well, why would God harden Pharaoh's heart only to punish him for having a hardened heart? Does that make sense? Why would somebody say something? Right. Is it unjust that God would harden Pharaoh's heart and then punish him for having that hardened heart? Or punish his people? Why would God do that so he could judge Egypt more severely with additional plagues? Valid question, right? But the first thing to mention and remember is Pharaoh was not an innocent man, right? He wasn't a godly man. Pretty evil man. He's a brutal dictator. He oversaw the abuse and the oppression of the Israelites. And the Pharaoh that God hardened was evil. And the nation he ruled either agreed with him or at least didn't disapprove of what he was doing. But on at least a couple of occasions, you see that Pharaoh himself hardened his own heart as well when it came to letting the Israelites go. Exodus 8:15 says, "But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart." Exodus 8:32 says, "And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also." So when you see that, it seems that both God and Pharaoh were active in a way of hardening his heart. Yes, God played a role in hardening his heart, but you also see that Pharaoh himself also played a role in that. And God gave Pharaoh increasingly severe warnings of the final judgment to come, but he chose to bring further judgment on himself by hardening his heart. And not, God's given him warnings, but he didn't want to hear it. So it could be that as a result of Pharaoh's hard-heartedness, God hardened his heart even further, which allowed for the last few plagues and bringing God's full glory into view. Pharaoh and Egypt brought these judgments on themselves, really, with 400 years of slavery and mass murder. But if you think about it, the Bible tells us the wages of sin is death. And Pharaoh had horribly sinned against God. And when that question of being just or unjust, if the wages of sin is death, it would have been just of God just to annihilate Egypt altogether. But did he do that? No. So God hardening Pharaoh's heart was not unjust. His bringing of additional plagues wasn't unjust. But in fact, as terrible as they were, it shows God's mercy in a way. Because if the wages of sin are death, God could have just destroyed Egypt immediately. Romans chapter 9, verses 17 and 18 says, "For the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for the same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. Therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will hardeneth." So from a human perspective, it does seem wrong for God to harden somebody's heart and then punish them for having a hardened heart. It sounds weird. Would you agree with that? Sounds kind of weird. Biblically speaking, though, we have all sinned against God. And the just thing to do for that sin is what? Death. That's what we deserve, is death. So God hardening and punishing a person is not necessarily unjust. It's actually kind of merciful in a way compared to what it could be. Does that make sense? But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting just to see why God sent the specific plagues he did, like who he was targeting, things like that. And I could even imagine just the Egyptians going through that. And then I think some of probably his servants started to realize, all right, like the magicians or said, this is the finger of God, right? Or they ran away from Moses once the boils came. But Pharaoh's heart was just hardened, and he refused to let them go. But God's powerful. God always has a plan. He's always going to show his people that he's the true God. And it's pretty amazing when you read through the story. So let's pray. Lord, thank you for just, again, helping us gather in here this morning, just helping us get here safely, and just reading your word and just realizing how powerful you are, how merciful you are. and just that you're in control of everything, no matter who tries to stop that or interrupt that. Lord, we ask that you bless Pastor Steve's message to follow this morning, and just thank you for everything you do for us. In Jesus' name.